Deaths in Glenmorach Manor, a fiction novel. Written by Shirley, read by Sir Lawrence Olivier. This audiobook was narrated using synthetic voice technology provided by 11 Labs. Chapter 27. Attention in the study had reached its breaking point. Alan Faulkner, now kneeling on the cold floor, was broken. His bravado gone, his fate sealed. The room was silent, save for the occasional sob from Mrs. Thompson, who, despite the horror unfolding before her eyes, seemed unwilling to let go of her misplaced loyalty. Lord Wallace's expression was one of disbelief and grief, while Robert's face was set in grim determination. I took a steadying breath, knowing this next part would hit the hardest of all. The truth about Benjamin Wallace's death had been waiting to be uncovered, and now it was time to lay it bare. "My lord, may I continue now?" Suddenly my voice broke through the silence and tension in the study room. "You may," said Lord Wallace. I began. A small bottle that was found rolled under Robert's bed that night was no ordinary bottle. It contained a substance derived from a poisonous plant, black nightshade. There was a collective gasp from the room. Alan's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and confusion, and his lips trembled as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. I looked around the room, making sure everyone was paying attention. Then I continued. Black nightshade is a highly toxic plant. Just a few drops of its extract can cause paralysis, confusion, and eventually death. It was this poison that Alan intended to use on Robert Wallace that night. But as I mentioned earlier, the plan failed, because Rosie caught him before he could carry it out. The weight of my words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Lady Eleanor, standing by her father's side, looked pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. I saw her occasionally holding back sobs, yet her tears continued to flow down her cheeks. The silence in the room deepening. I continued. But that's not all. A similar poison was also the cause of Benjamin Wallace's death. The words hit the family like a thunderclap. Lord Wallace's face twisted in horror. He was still processing everything, but he had heard enough to understand the implications. He whispered, his voice trembling. "No, you're saying Benjamin was poisoned?" I nodded gravely. "Yes, my lord. The poison used to kill Benjamin was similar to the one Alan intended for Robert, but derived from a different poisonous plant called mandrake." Suddenly, Alan interrupted me and tried to defend himself. "My lord, I didn't even live here. How could I?" I spoke to him. "You don't have to live here to murder Mr. Benjamin Wallace. You were here that day, the day when Benjamin was found dead in the library." "My lord, I was here. That's true, but it was in the afternoon." "My lord, from what I have heard, Mr. Benjamin was found dead later at night after the dinner event. If I poisoned him, he should have been dead before the dinner even started." Alan was indeed very smart at evading to convince Lord Wallace that he was not guilty. He wasn't done speaking yet. "I have witnesses." "Mrs. Thompson and Lady Eleanor witnessed my presence at the manor that afternoon, my lord." Alan still seemed to make an effort to protect himself. "It was late in the afternoon," I interrupted him. "And where again did you talk to Mrs. Thompson?" "In the dining room," he answered in a hushed voice. "Exactly," I answered. But then Alan tried to deny it. His tone was fierce. "But at that time, so many people worked in the dining area preparing for the event. Would that make them all the murderers, Mr. Owen?" Mrs. Thompson, who had been silent up until now, suddenly cried out, her voice cracking with emotion. "I was the one responsible for setting up the dining table. Are you also accusing me, Mr. Owen?" I shook my head, my gaze unwavering. "Mrs. Thompson, I haven't even finished. I know you want to protect him, but if you pay attention to me, I will show you that he was responsible for Mr. Benjamin's death." Mrs. Thompson rushed to Alan's side, her hands shaking as she tried to help him to his feet, as if she could somehow shield him from the truth. "This whole accusation, it's too much for him. He's not well. He needs rest, not this cruel accusation." Lord Wallace screamed, "Silence." "Mr. Owen, please continue. How can you explain your accusation that Alan murdered Benjamin using poison and how he accessed the library that night? I could see Lady Eleanor's face drain of color as the full weight of her brother's death suddenly settled over her. She looked from me to Alan, her expression one of shock and anger, but also fear. And I continued. Benjamin died the night after the dinner. It's no coincidence that he suddenly developed a pounding headache during dinner. The poison that he had already consumed had affected him at that point. The autopsy report states that traces of poison were found in his system. The dagger that was plunged into his back was only a decoy to cover up the true cause of death. He stole the Wallace family's prized dagger from the drawing room to murder Benjamin and make it appear like one of the family members did it. Lord Wallace's face contorted with grief and shock. So, you're telling me that Benjamin wasn't killed by the dagger? I presented Lord Wallace with the autopsy and the toxicology reports for Benjamin Wallace from my folder. Correct. The poison caused Benjamin's death, not the wound. The dagger missed his vital internal organs. And if not for the poison, he might have survived that night. But the poison, just like the one intended for Robert, was slowly weakening him. And once the dose was high enough, it was fatal. As I spoke, I could see the weight of the truth crashing down on Lord Wallace. His son was gone because of a slow and deliberate poisoning, a murder masked by a stabbing that had, in reality, been an afterthought. I said, the poison was derived from mandrake, a deadly plant with a long history of use in murders, and this is how Alan did it. I discovered these plants last week while investigating Anthony's disappearance. And those plants appeared to have been intentionally cultivated in what seemed like an abandoned house just outside the village. But more importantly, it was in that house that I found the person who sold the poison to Alan, an elderly woman who has already been arrested and now is in custody. At the mention of the elderly woman, Alan's face grew pale, his expression both startled and fearful. He tried to steady himself, but failed. His past actions were catching up to him, and there was no escape now. I explained. I asked her to whom she sold the deadly potion before handing her over to the authorities, but she told me that she never met her buyer. The buyer left the payment at the back door of a small cabin and requested the poison be delivered secretly. This was a clever tactic by the murderer to remain anonymous. Alan shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling, but I wasn't finished yet. The woman led us to a small cabin near the vineyard and showed us where she left the 2 poison orders. That's where, surprisingly, we discovered something else. We found Anthony was being held hostage in the basement of that cabin, tied to a bed frame rail. The room was quiet, but the shock on everyone's faces told me that the true horror of what had been happening in their midst was finally sinking in. And suddenly, Anthony chimed in, asking me, so Alan was the mastermind behind my kidnapping? Yes, Anthony, he was, I replied. Anthony's eyes widened as if he couldn't believe the reality he had just heard. Then I continued. Alan was also behind the attack on Robert in the cellar. It seems that he was targeting all the heirs of the Wallace family one by one. The room was silent for a moment as the truth settled over everyone like a suffocating blanket. Lord Wallace's eyes were fixed on me, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of his chair, his face pale with disbelief. I continued, pushing the evidence forward. I have more evidence that proves Alan's involvement. John found a blood-stained blade in the small cabin where Anthony was held. The blood on that blade matches Alan's DNA. Alan was furiously interrupting me. Of course it has my blood on it. I was stabbed using that blade. Alan then convinced one of the workers, Peter Jenkins, to hide the blade in the small cabin. Alan threatened Peter, telling him that if he ever spoke a word about it, he would kill Peter's family. Anthony's face drained of color, and he looked as though he might collapse. The truth was a crushing weight, one that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. I turned my gaze to Lord Wallace. Now back to Benjamin's murder. My lord, you asked me earlier how the murderer gained access to the library that night to kill Benjamin. Let me explain. Lydia, one of the maids I questioned, claimed to have seen Alan speaking with Mrs. Thompson in the dining room that late afternoon. When she made her second trip to the dining room, it was empty, and it seemed like the room was ready for the occasion. But she noticed the door was slightly open, which is uncommon because all maids are told to always close the door after finishing their work. Only someone unfamiliar with the house rules could have left it open. While the room was empty, he poisoned Benjamin's plates and glasses with a clear, undetectable poison, which is why only Benjamin was affected during dinner. Alan tried to deny it. "My lord, I stopped for a short chat with Mrs. Thompson, just like what I'd do with any other co-workers." Lord Wallace's eyes widened as I continued. "I'm not done yet." After he was done with his mission in the dining room, he went into the west greenhouse to speak with Lady Eleanor. The gardener saw them together having a private conversation. They were meeting in secret. Lady Eleanor's face turned a deep shade of crimson, and she lowered her head, avoiding everyone's gaze. It was clear now that she feared the truth of her covert relationship with Alan being exposed. She had been hiding it, and now it was out in the open for all to see. I turned my attention back to Alan. After talking to Lady Eleanor, Alan never left the manor. Suddenly, Alan interrupted me. "In my defense, my lord, it was a stormy day with heavy rain. I thought I would stay in the manor to wait until the rain stopped." "Out of all the people in the manor, you only suspect me, Mr. Owen," said Alan to deny it. I continued speaking while locking eyes with Alan. He was never gone that night. I had Mr. Morrison provide me with a list of staff on duty that evening, and Alan's name was obviously not on it. When I questioned one of the servants, Thomas told me that he saw Alan come out of the dining room and head towards the drawing room, where the Wallace family's prized dagger was kept. Around dinner time, again Thomas saw Alan open the kitchen back door to receive the wine order from the winery. Oddly enough, Thomas thought it was strange that after receiving the wine, Alan headed to the mudroom, took off the boots, and went upstairs to the servants' quarters. But Alan has been a regular visitor, so he didn't think much of it. Alan asked me in his sarcastic tone, "Don't you feel strange about how Thomas noticed every way of my steps that night, Mr. Owen? Do you believe in everything he said?" I should say he was very smart that way. I looked at Alan and tried my best to not be lured into falling for his scheming game. I kept continuing. Alan was hiding in the servants' quarters and planning his next move. He observed Benjamin from a distance, waiting for the moment when he was alone. When he found him by himself in the library, Alan approached him. Knowing he was already weakened by the poison, he stabbed him in the back. The death was swift because the poison had already done most of the work. Benjamin was too weak to scream when the dagger entered his body. He died in silence, and no one heard a thing. I paused for a moment to let the weight of my words settle before I continued. After committing the murder, Alan exposed the fuse area in the basement to water, which caused a power outage and shut off the manor's power supply. The stormy night and heavy rain were beneficial for him, and the darkness allowed him to escape unnoticed. That night I went down to the basement to examine the power source area where the fuses were located. The damaged fuses and the surrounding areas were wet. I came back to check the fuse area again in the morning. There was no leak from the roof or anywhere to be the cause of that power outage to happen on the previous night. Clear to me, it was done intentionally. Alan was in complete silence. He really couldn't think of the possibility that I would check the fuse area, which he had manipulated. John responded to my explanation. "Wow, I'm speechless, mate. How everything was well managed to carry out his crime." Robert Wallace, who had been silent up until now, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Owen, how did you initially think it was me? You saw those wet boot prints in the library. The pattern looked like from my rubber boot soles." I turned to Robert, my voice calm but firm. "Because those wet prints were from your boots, Mr. Robert. I will explain how they got there. Alan knew that after Benjamin's death, you would be the next successor to the Wallace. He planned to frame you for the crime. Earlier, when he picked up the wine order, it was raining and the ground was muddy. Later, Alan used your boots again when he went to the library to end Benjamin's life, leaving evidence to make it seem like you were the murderer. To strengthen his plan, he used the family dagger to stab Benjamin and left it behind for us to discover. Robert's face grew pale. So, Alan wants me to appear as the murderer of my own brother. He wants me to get arrested for the crime he had committed. I replied, nodding. Yeah, I found your wet boots in the mudroom that night, which seemed odd. You were wearing them earlier in the hallway when John and I arrived at Glenmorach Manor. After over 8 hours, they should have dried unless you went out again. Later that evening, he wore them to receive the wine order outside in heavy rain. That explains why the boots stayed wet and left those wet prints in the library. I could see Robert's jaw tighten as the full gravity of the situation sank in. I asked Robert then, "Do you want to know how I found out it was you who sneaked into the library that night?" Like being struck by lightning, Robert was shocked when I revealed his actions that night, sneaking into the library. He seemed incredulous, wondering how I could have found out. Don't worry, Mr. Robert. I know you just wanted to save Rosie, and I will explain now. I spoke with a restrained smile, making him even more anxious. I turned my attention back to Alan, then I started to speak. When I questioned the gardener, he told me that he had seen Alan with Lady Eleanor in the greenhouse that late afternoon. The gardener had found a woman's handkerchief, which he thought belonged to Lady Eleanor. He gave it to Alan to give it to Lady Eleanor. But when Alan saw the initial R on it, he realized it belonged to Rosie. He had the idea to plant it at the crime scene, hoping it would lead us to believe that Rosie had killed Benjamin out of jealousy. Alan also framed Rosie Taylor. He even smeared a bit of Benjamin's blood on it. I turned to Robert. I know you tried to protect Rosie, but in doing so, you put yourself in danger. You returned to the crime scene to get the handkerchief, and I mistook you for the murderer. You should have talked to me and not misplaced anything from the crime scene. In this case, what you did was wrong, Mr. Robert. Robert nodded solemnly. Yes, I know I was being stupid, because I assumed you would never believe me that Rosie was innocent. With the final pieces of the puzzle now in place, I looked around the room, meeting each of their eyes. Alan Faulkner, you murdered both Benjamin Wallace and Rosie Taylor. You attempted to kill Robert and kidnapped Anthony. We have no choice but to hand you over to the authorities. Alan looked around the room, his face ashen, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His game was up. The Wallace family would never be the same again. Lady Eleanor looked at Alan with a gaze full of deep sorrow and disappointment. I saw her tears streaming endlessly, especially after hearing my accusation against Alan, the man she loved, her childhood friend. The study was thick with tension as I took the final steps toward conclusively linking Alan Faulkner to the brutal deaths of Benjamin Wallace and Rosie Taylor. Everyone in the room had fallen silent, hanging on my every word. I knew the truth was almost too much to bear for the Wallace family, but it had to be done. I said, keeping my voice steady. But to make it fair for you, here I present all the evidence supporting my accusation. I reached into my bag and pulled out a brown suede jacket with bloodstains on the wrists of the right sleeve. The room's collective gaze fixed on it as I held it up for Lord Wallace to see. My lord, this jacket was found in the small cabin where I discovered Anthony Wallace trapped in the basement. It belongs to Alan Faulkner. Lord Wallace's eyes widened with disbelief. You mean to say those bloodstains in the jacket? Yes, my lord. These bloodstains at the cuff of the right sleeve had been tested, and the result confirms it was Benjamin's blood. I could see the horror mounting on Lord Wallace's face. His expression was unreadable, but it was clear that he was struggling to come to terms with what was unfolding in front of him. Robert Wallace, still recovering from the shock of the revelations, spoke up. He asked, his voice a little shaky. Mr. Owen, what made you suspect Alan and decide to take the bloody used bandage and do the blood test on it? I met Lord Wallace's gaze, fully aware that the answer to Robert's question was crucial. I started to suspect him because of the smell of this jacket. Likely it came from a horse stable. Look at what I found inside the pocket of this jacket. A small bottle containing a tiny amount of liquid. This was the poison Alan used to coat the utensils Benjamin used. Alan's fingerprints were found on this bottle. I got the sample of his fingerprints when I offered him a glass of water the last time I visited him in recovery. Lord Wallace looked as though he was seeing everything in a new light. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Robert leaned forward, a look of understanding dawning on his face as he spoke. That makes sense. Alan used to come in and out of the manor frequently. He knows the house like the back of his hand. He knows where the Wallace family's prized dagger was kept. That is how he worked on everything to make it appear as if the murder was committed by someone from within the manor. I nodded, allowing the significance of Robert's statement to settle in. And there's more. Alan used his neck scarf to cover the dagger. He did this so that his fingerprints wouldn't be found on the weapon. That's why this very neck scarf has Benjamin's blood on it. The room fell silent. The evidence I presented was irrefutable, and it left Alan with nowhere to hide. His only defense now was to deny everything, but it was clear to everyone in the room that the walls were closing in on him. Lord Wallace, who had been silent for some time, let out a low groan, his face pale and his hands shaking as he gripped the arms of his wheelchair. "This is too much for me to bear." Lord Wallace sobbed as he recalled the death of Benjamin Wallace, his beloved eldest son. "You tore my family apart with your betrayal. You murdered and attacked my both sons, kidnapped my nephew, and killed Rosie." His voice broke as he spoke, and I could see the weight of the years of trust and power crashing down on him. His eldest son, Benjamin, was dead, and his family was being consumed by betrayal from within. Lady Eleanor's face twisted in anger. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. "I can't believe this. After killing my brother Benjamin, you were trying to kill Robert as well. You would have killed him only to get me. For what, Alan? Only to keep this family's inheritance to yourself." Alan whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "I love you for real, my lady. Believe me, I have my own reason, and one day you will understand." His words were the final admission, and the room fell into an eerie silence. It was as though the full weight of what had happened, of how deep the betrayal ran, was settling over everyone in the room. Even Mrs. Thompson, who had tried so hard to protect Alan, looked at him in the eyes, her hands trembling in her lap. I thought she could no longer deny the truth. Lord Wallace's voice was hollow as he spoke, his eyes distant and broken. "So, you've admitted it. It was you all along. You poisoned and killed my son, Benjamin, and you would have killed Robert, too." "Yes," Alan whispered, his voice barely heard. "But I only want justice, my lord. You are the reason why I lost my father, and I want to avenge him." The irony hung heavy in the air. Alan's statement that he had his reasons and was merely seeking justice baffled all of us in the study room. What kind of justice was he referring to? Why did he say Lord Wallace was the reason he lost his father? I looked at Lord Wallace. It seemed like he was confused, and he didn't know what he had just heard. "What are you talking about? Who is your father? Do not create such a lie. I never know your father." Lady Eleanor stood still for a moment, her shoulders shaking as she held back sobs. When she finally turned around, her face was pale, but there was a new understanding in her eyes. The man she had trusted, the man she had been in love with, had deceived her in the cruelest way imaginable. Lady Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse. I can't believe this, Alan. Why? Why did you do all this?" "I love you, my lady. One day you will know and understand why I've done all this," Alan said, his voice barely more than a broken whisper. Lord Wallace shouted at Alan. "Enough! Stop saying that you love my daughter. Who do you think you are? You are just a horse trainer, and yet you dare to harbor romantic feelings for your mistress. You are not worthy of her, never have been, and never will be." Lord Wallace spoke with his cold and final voice. "You have betrayed us all, Alan Faulkner. You thought you could escape the consequences, but now we know the truth. and you will pay for your actions. Then, as the room was consumed by shock and disbelief, Lord Wallace suddenly opened a drawer, pulled out a gun, and pointed it at Alan. His face contorted with rage. His eyes, normally so composed, were now wild and furious. Everyone held their breath, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. "Lord Wallace, no!" I shouted, stepping forward, but he didn't hear me. His hands trembled as he pointed the gun directly at Alan's head. The room erupted in a chorus of screams. Robert cried, his voice cracking with panic. "Papa, put the gun down. Please, Papa." Lady Eleanor, her face streaked with tears, clutched her hands to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. "Stop, Papa. Please, stop." She begged, her word a desperate plea. The tension in the room was unbearable. Anthony and John were standing there, frozen and speechless. Everyone was not knowing whether to step forward to intervene or remain still. But suddenly, it was Mrs. Thompson's voice that broke the silence. She cried, her voice ragged with emotion. "Please, Lord Wallace, stop! I beg you." "Don't do it. Don't kill him. He's your own son." The words landed like a thunderclap, stunning everyone into absolute silence. Alan's face turned pale as a ghost, and for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability crossed his features. The gun trembled in Lord Wallace's hand, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Not a sound, not a breath. My mind raced as I tried to process what Mrs. Thompson had just revealed. Her words echoed in my ears. "He's your own son. How is it even possible? Could Alan Faulkner truly be Lord Wallace's son? Then why did Alan say Lord Wallace was the reason he lost his father?" The room was still, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. Lord Wallace, still holding the gun, stood frozen. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his body was palpable. Then, with a harsh exhale, he lowered the weapon, his hands shaking as he dropped it to the desk. What did you just say?" he whispered, the fury in his eyes turning to confusion and pain. The room remained silent, and for the first time in a long while, Lord Wallace appeared utterly lost. He turned to Mrs. Thompson, his voice hoarse. Mrs. Thompson looked like she was on the verge of collapse, her hands clutching her chest as though she were holding her breath. "My lord, Alan is your son. He's truly your son." The words hit the room like a bomb. Everyone stared at Mrs. Thompson, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what she had just said. The pieces of the puzzle, which had seemed so clear just moments before, suddenly blurred into a whirl of confusion and disbelief. Lady Eleanor whispered, barely able to speak. "Your son. Alan Faulkner is your son. How is that possible, Papa?" She looked from her father to Mrs. Thompson, her face pale with shock. Lord Wallace spoke while gasping for breath and trembling. I can't believe it. No. It can't be true." He seemed shocked to hear what Mrs. Thompson said about Alan. Robert asked his father, "What kind of nonsense is this, Papa? Is that true? Do you know all about this? Did you keep a story that we never know?" Alan's lips parted as if he was about to speak, but no sound came out. His eyes darted around the room, wild with a mixture of fear and anticipation, as if he were trying to gauge the reactions of everyone present. I could barely believe what had just been revealed. Was Alan Faulkner, the man who had deceived and manipulated everyone in the Wallace family, actually Lord Wallace's son? It seemed impossible. Lord Wallace felt his body trembling and weakening, and he nearly fell from his wheelchair, his face now a mask of anguish. "No, it can't be true. You lied. You lied to me, didn't you?" His voice was full of emotion. Mrs. Thompson, now in tears, nodded sadly. "Forgive me, my lord. I never wanted this to come out. I never wanted to hurt you or the family, but it's true. Alan is your son." The room fell silent again, And at that moment I realized that everything had changed. Alan wasn't just the killer. He wasn't just the man who had manipulated everyone. He was also the flesh and blood of the very family he had betrayed. Meanwhile, Alan could only curl up on the floor in deep tension. As if struck by lightning, Mrs. Thompson's words, revealing that he was the son of Lord Wallace, shattered his heart. Was he the abandoned child? Why was he the only one cast away among all of Lord Wallace's children? Then who was his real mother? Is it true that all this time he had been in love with his own sister? All of this revelation made him feel guilty for loving Lady Eleanor, and even disgusted with himself. His heart broke thinking about all the suffering he had endured, living in poverty and working hard in his father's horse stable, while his 3 siblings enjoyed a decent life as children of a noble family. Lady Eleanor felt her heart pounding so hard, as if she couldn't believe the reality she had to face. Too much devastation to endure in just one day, and the most painful thing was that she had to accept the reality. For all this time, she had desired a man who, in truth, was her own brother. My voice broke the silence. Mrs. Thompson, I just want to tell you that what you have just claimed about Alan can be tested. So please, tell us the truth. Unable to say anything, Mrs. Thompson could only nod weakly. Her tears streamed down her wrinkled face. She kept holding Alan tightly to protect him from the threat of Lord Wallace's gunfire. I swear that it's true, sir. She nodded her head repeatedly.